The soft glow of the early morning sun filtered through the bustling halls of Meridian International Airport. Among the stream of travelers, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, a graceful elderly black woman in her late 70s, waited patiently in line. She was preparing to board a flight she had been eagerly anticipating for months. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, a beige cardigan, and her treasured pearl earrings, Margaret radiated quiet dignity. Her silver hair was styled into soft curls beneath a small navy hat, and in her steady hands she held a well-worn leather handbag, a cherished keepsake from her late husband. This journey was significant for Margaret. It was her first flight in over 20 years, and the first time she would meet her great-grandchildren in person. The thought of their little faces filled her with a mix of joy and nervous excitement. Air travel was not something she often experienced, and for this special occasion, her son had gone out of his way to book her a seat on Lumiere Airways, a luxury airline known for its premium service. "Mom, you deserve to fly in comfort," her son had insisted. Margaret had hesitated at first, but she eventually accepted his gift, grateful for the chance to avoid the exhaustion of a long bus ride. As the boarding process began, Margaret quietly observed the crowd around her, a mixture of polished, well-dressed travelers. She noticed the occasional glance or whisper, but she had long learned to rise above such subtle judgments. Her focus remained on her ticket, row 2A, and the pleasant thought of sitting near the front. Margaret smiled softly, pleased with the arrangement. When her boarding group was called, she stepped forward with graceful composure, unfazed by the rush of passengers eager to get ahead. Handing her ticket to the gate agent, she gave a warm smile. The agent, a young woman with dark hair tied in a bun, scanned the ticket, hesitated for a brief second, and then forced a polite yet stiff smile. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said, her tone lacking warmth. Margaret brushed it off, letting her excitement carry her forward as she entered the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the soft ambient lighting and plush leather seats gleamed. Margaret was immediately captivated. This was a world far removed from her everyday life, a rare indulgence she allowed herself for this treasured trip. For decades, Margaret had put the needs of others ahead of her own. Now, at long last, she was embracing a small moment of luxury. Upon reaching seat 2A, a window seat, Margaret paused to take in the spaciousness around her. She gently placed her handbag by her feet and reached up to store her modest carry-on. However, just as she began to lift it, a sharp voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice belonged to Linda Prescott, the lead flight attendant. Her tone was clipped, and she spoke with the kind of authority that left little room for warmth. Margaret turned to face Linda, a tall, sharply dressed woman in her late 30s, wearing the navy and gold uniform of Lumiere Airways. Linda's expression was professionally neutral but laced with an unmistakable air of irritation. "Is this your seat?" Linda asked, her eyes quickly scanning Margaret as if questioning whether she belonged there. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied calmly, lifting her boarding pass for Linda to see. Linda leaned in, narrowing her eyes as she scrutinized the pass. After a tense pause, she gave a curt nod. "Fine. Please stow your bag quickly, so we can keep the line moving," Linda instructed, her voice tight. Margaret reached for the overhead compartment again. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the nervous excitement of being in unfamiliar surroundings. As Margaret gently adjusted her bag, Linda crossed her arms and let out a long, audible sigh, loud enough to turn heads. Her displeasure was apparent to those seated nearby. "Do you need help?" Linda asked stiffly, though her tone suggested that offering assistance was the last thing she wanted to do. Before Margaret could answer, a man sitting across the aisle stood up with a warm smile. "I've got it, ma'am," he said kindly, taking the bag from her hands and placing it in the compartment with ease. Margaret's face brightened with gratitude. "Thank you, young man," she said softly, her appreciation clear. Linda's eyes darkened, her expression soured, as if the act of kindness had somehow inconvenienced her. "Let's not hold up the line," Linda said sharply, turning away. Her voice carried just enough edge to make nearby passengers glance toward Margaret's seat. As Margaret settled in, she felt the weight of fleeting glances from around the cabin. Some passengers looked on with curiosity, others with indifference, and a few with subtle discomfort. Margaret, however, remained calm. She had faced such unspoken judgments before and had learned not to let the perceptions of others define her worth. Folding her hands in her lap, she gazed out the window, focusing on the excitement of seeing her great-grandchildren for the first time. The flight had yet to take off, but it was already clear that this journey would be unlike any other. Margaret Ellis sat quietly in her seat, her hands resting gently on her lap as the soft hum of conversation filled the cabin. Around her, the other passengers were settling in, their attention flickering between their phones and the attendants moving up and down the aisle. Margaret tried to focus on the excitement that lay ahead, the sweet giggles of her great-grandchildren and the stories she longed to share with them. Yet, the cold undercurrent of Linda Prescott's gaze lingered in the background. As Linda patrolled the aisle, her eyes drifted toward Margaret more often than seemed necessary. The expression Linda wore was difficult to decipher, not outright hostile, but certainly not welcoming. Margaret was no stranger to such glances. Life had taught her how to endure them without losing her grace. She carried herself with quiet strength, aware that many would underestimate her. Still, as resilient as she was, each instance of prejudice left its mark, a small but undeniable ache that reminded her of the road she had walked. What neither Linda nor the other passengers knew, however, was that Margaret's presence on this flight would soon set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond this cabin. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Linda's focus never strayed far from Margaret. From the moment Margaret had boarded, Linda's demeanor had shifted, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal thinly veiled irritation. To Linda, Margaret's presence in row 2A felt disruptive, as though it threatened the smooth, orderly environment she prided herself on maintaining. Once the passengers were seated, Margaret attempted to fasten her seatbelt, but the latch seemed to stick, refusing to click into place. Wanting to ensure her safety, she gently pressed the call button above her. The sound of heels tapping against the floor signaled Linda's approach. She halted abruptly at Margaret's row, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Yes, what is it now?" Linda asked, her voice heavy with impatience. Margaret met Linda's sharpness with a soft, warm smile. "I believe my seatbelt isn't working properly. Would you mind assisting me?" Margaret said calmly. Linda exhaled loudly, the exasperation evident as nearby passengers turned their heads. She leaned in, tugging at the belt for only a brief moment before straightening up. "There's nothing wrong with it. You just need to pull harder," Linda said flatly. "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied with grace, gently adjusting the belt herself. Without another word, Linda pivoted and strode down the aisle, muttering under her breath, just loud enough for those close by to hear. "Special requests already? This is going to be a long flight," she hissed. Margaret heard her, but she let the words pass without response. A few minutes later, Margaret realized she had forgotten to take her medication before boarding. She hesitated, her eyes glancing down the aisle toward Linda, who stood near the galley chatting with a fellow crew member. Margaret knew Linda's demeanor was anything but inviting, but her health took precedence over avoiding confrontation. Steadying herself, she pressed the call button once more. Linda returned, her expression stiffer than before, lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes?" Linda asked curtly, her arms crossing once again. Margaret's tone remained soft and apologetic. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but may I have a small cup of water to take my medicine?" Linda let out a theatrical sigh, loud enough to earn a few disapproving glances from nearby passengers. "We haven't even taken off yet, ma'am. Water service starts at cruising altitude. You'll have to wait," Linda replied coldly. Margaret offered a patient nod. "I understand, dear. It's just for my medication. I won't trouble you again after this," she explained gently. Rolling her eyes, Linda disappeared into the galley. When she returned, she placed a small plastic cup on Margaret's tray with unnecessary force, the loud clatter drawing more attention. Margaret smiled kindly as though the cup had been placed with care. "Thank you very much," she said, sipping the water and taking her medication quietly. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The small display had not gone unnoticed, and several passengers exchanged looks of quiet disapproval. Moments later, Linda returned, this time with another flight attendant trailing behind her. Her stance radiated authority as she stopped in front of Margaret. "Excuse me, ma'am," Linda announced, her voice louder than necessary. "Are you sure you're seated in the correct section? This area is reserved for premium passengers." Margaret blinked, her brow lifting slightly in confusion. "Yes, I'm certain. My ticket says 2A, she replied, producing her boarding pass and holding it out for Linda to inspect. Linda snatched the ticket with an air of skepticism, her eyes narrowing as she examined it. After a long pause, she returned the pass with visible reluctance. "Well, it looks like you are in the right seat," she said tersely. "Next time, please ensure you board with the correct group. Following procedures is important." Margaret's voice remained calm. "I did board with my group, dear," she responded softly. Linda said nothing more. Instead, she turned sharply, murmuring something under her breath as she walked away. Margaret caught fragments of her words, "slowing things down" and "doesn't belong." A faint ache stirred in Margaret's chest, though she had faced such treatment before. No matter how many times it happened, it always left a mark. The final insult came as Linda reappeared, pausing at Margaret's row once more. "Ma'am, your handbag must remain under the seat at all times," Linda stated firmly, her tone as if scolding a child. Margaret looked down, gently nudging her bag further beneath the seat. "It's already under the seat, dear," she said softly. Linda glanced down and, realizing her mistake, stiffened. Rather than admit the error, she added brusquely, "Well, just keep it there. I'll be checking." Passengers whispered quietly, the tension thickening. Margaret kept her gaze forward, allowing the whispers to fade behind her. She would not let Linda's disdain cloud the reason for her journey. Ahead of her was warmth, family, and love. Things far greater than prejudice could diminish. Margaret Ellis adjusted her bag quietly beneath the seat, feeling the weight of Linda Prescott's lingering gaze. She knew the flight attendant was watching her, but Margaret chose not to react. Passengers nearby had begun to notice the subtle hostility in Linda's tone and actions. Across the aisle, a young woman leaned in slightly and whispered, "Don't worry, ma'am. She's been like that since we boarded. You're not doing anything wrong." Margaret offered a gentle smile of appreciation. "Thank you, dear," she replied softly. Still, the tension in the air was undeniable. Margaret could feel Linda's frustration simmering just beneath the surface. It was clear to everyone around them that Linda had singled Margaret out, her cold demeanor toward the elderly woman starkly contrasting her warm treatment of other passengers. Margaret closed her eyes and took a slow breath, reminding herself of the reason for this journey, the sweet, excited faces of her great-grandchildren waiting to greet her. Their laughter and hugs would make any discomfort worth enduring. But Margaret had no idea that this was just the beginning of Linda's behavior. As the plane lifted off, Margaret gazed out the window. The clouds rolled by beneath her, and the endless expanse of blue sky filled her heart with calm. She tried to lose herself in the beauty outside, imagining the small hands of her great-grandchildren reaching for hers. However, the unease in the cabin remained. Linda began her rounds with the beverage cart, moving swiftly through the rows ahead of Margaret. Passengers were served quickly, each greeted with a polite, if robotic, smile. But as Linda reached Margaret's row, the warmth she displayed with others disappeared. Margaret glanced up as Linda approached. "Excuse me, dear," Margaret said gently. "Could I have a small cup of water?" Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. "Water?" she repeated as though the request was unreasonable. "Yes, just a little," Margaret replied, maintaining her soft but steady tone. Linda placed one hand on her hip, her expression hardening. "Ma'am, this isn't a charity," she snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The cabin fell uncomfortably quiet. Heads turned toward Margaret's row, and a few people exchanged surprised glances. Margaret felt her cheeks flush, but she remained composed. She had faced situations like this before and knew better than to meet hostility with anger. "I'm sorry if my request inconvenienced you," Margaret said gently. "I just need to stay hydrated for my health." Linda's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she said nothing to Margaret. Instead, she turned to her fellow flight attendant and, in a tone dripping with sarcasm, muttered, "I guess we're running a water drive now." A quiet chuckle followed, though it felt more like a jab than humor. Before Margaret could respond, a small voice emerged from across the aisle. "You can have my water, ma'am." Margaret looked up to see a young girl, no older than 9, holding out a half-full bottle of water. The girl's big, innocent eyes radiated sincerity and kindness. "I don't need it," the child added earnestly. Margaret's heart swelled at the gesture. A warm smile spread across her face as she gently accepted the bottle. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "You're very kind." The girl's parents smiled at Margaret, nodding approvingly at their daughter's generosity. Linda, meanwhile, stood stiffly by the cart. Her face flushed slightly as the quiet exchange unfolded before her. The growing support Margaret received from the passengers clearly unsettled Linda. "Let's keep the aisle clear," Linda barked suddenly, shoving the beverage cart forward with more force than necessary. Margaret twisted the cap off the bottle and took a small sip. The cool water eased the dryness in her throat, and she carefully placed the bottle on her tray table. Despite the turbulent emotions swirling around her, Margaret's hands remained steady. Across the aisle, the girl's mother leaned over. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded with a gentle smile. "I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for raising such a thoughtful little girl." The mother's eyes softened, and she gave her daughter's hand a gentle squeeze, pride evident on her face. But Linda's frustration only deepened as she watched the exchange. Her glances toward Margaret grew sharper, and her movements more rigid. It was clear that the quiet acts of kindness directed at Margaret undermined Linda's attempt to make her feel unwelcome. Yet Margaret remained calm. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the window, letting the endless blue sky offer her peace. She knew that the small ripple of kindness spreading around her would last far longer than Linda's bitterness. Margaret Ellis kept her gaze on the horizon beyond the plane window, the soft clouds stretching endlessly below. She reminded herself of the hugs waiting for her at the end of this journey, the warmth of her great-grandchildren, the laughter that would fill the room. She had faced far worse in her lifetime, and she knew that patience and grace often outlasted cruelty. But Linda Prescott's actions weren't going unnoticed. Several passengers, disturbed by the flight attendant's behavior, had begun discreetly recording. Phones captured snippets of Linda's sharp tone and cold remarks, highlighting her pointed hostility. The passengers might not have known Margaret's full story, but they recognized mistreatment when they saw it. Linda's treatment wasn't just dismissive. It was deliberate, targeted. And yet, Linda remained unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her. Each time Margaret met Linda's disdain with soft composure, the flight attendant's irritation grew. Margaret's quiet strength, the whispered support from nearby passengers, and the small girl's offer of water, these things seemed to chip away at Linda's confidence. She could feel her control slipping, and it unsettled her. Linda lingered at the front of the cabin, casting frequent glances toward Margaret. From her perspective, Margaret's calm defiance was unacceptable. In Linda's mind, she needed to reassert herself. Her heels clicked sharply against the aisle floor as she strode down toward Margaret's row with purpose. "Ma'am," Linda said loudly, stopping just beside Margaret. "I need you to come with me, now." Margaret turned her head, startled by Linda's tone but still composed. "Is something the matter?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but firm. Linda crossed her arms tightly, her expression set in stone. "You've been causing a disturbance since boarding," Linda declared. "I've given you multiple warnings and you've refused to comply with instructions." A soft murmur spread across the cabin as passengers exchanged confused glances. They had witnessed Margaret's quiet demeanor and Linda's escalating hostility. No one believed Linda's claim. Margaret's brow furrowed in quiet disbelief. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I haven't disturbed anyone. I've simply been sitting here." Margaret replied. Linda's voice sharpened. "You've pressed the call button repeatedly, disrupted my duties, and refused to cooperate. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, Linda pivoted on her heel and marched to the front of the plane. Lifting the intercom, Linda's voice rang through the cabin. "Captain, we have a passenger in 2A who is being disruptive and non-compliant. I'm requesting immediate removal before takeoff." A ripple of gasps spread through the cabin. Passengers began voicing their objections. "She hasn't done anything wrong," the man seated behind Margaret called out. "This is ridiculous. another passenger muttered, shaking her head. Across the aisle, a woman in business attire quietly raised her phone, capturing the unfolding scene. Linda ignored the discontent and stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed, waiting for security. Moments later, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane, their expressions calm but serious. Linda gestured with a smug smile. "That's her?" Linda said, pointing toward Margaret. Margaret's heart felt heavy, but she refused to show it. With grace, she reached for her handbag, gently slipping the strap over her shoulder as she rose from her seat. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice low and kind. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Margaret nodded, keeping her chin lifted. "Of course," she replied softly. Before stepping away, she turned to the other passengers and offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," she said, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. As Margaret made her way down the aisle, escorted by the officers, murmurs of disapproval filled the space behind her. "This isn't right," a man called out. "She didn't do anything," another added, his voice thick with frustration. A tug on Margaret's cardigan caught her attention. She glanced down to see the same little girl who had offered her water, her eyes wide and filled with worry. "Mommy, why are they taking her away?" "She's nice," the child whispered, clutching her mother's hand. The girl's mother leaned down, her voice calm but firm. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people are treated unfairly. But don't worry, we won't let this go unnoticed." Margaret smiled softly at the child and gently patted her hand before continuing down the aisle. Her steps were steady, her head held high, even as Linda stood at the front of the plane, watching with quiet satisfaction. To Linda, this felt like a victory, a reassertion of her control and authority. In her mind, she had removed someone she believed didn't belong. But what Linda failed to realize was that her actions had been closely watched and meticulously documented. Several passengers had recorded the entire incident from start to finish, capturing every dismissive glare and every sharp remark. They had witnessed Margaret's calmness, her quiet resilience, and the clear injustice she endured. As Margaret stepped off the plane, the airport security officers guided her to a quiet seating area in the terminal. One of them, noticing the calm yet weary expression on her face, leaned in gently. "Ma'am, if you'd like to file a complaint, we can assist you," he said. Margaret smiled faintly and shook her head. "Thank you, but there's no need. Things have a way of sorting themselves out," she replied. Unbeknownst to Linda, the storm she had created was already beginning to unfold. Margaret Ellis sat quietly in the airport terminal, her hands resting gently in her lap. The hum of passing travelers drifted around her, but her thoughts lingered on the events that had just unfolded. She had always lived her life with dignity and grace, never one to stir trouble or demand attention. Yet, as much as she tried to brush it aside, the sting of being escorted from the plane still weighed heavily on her heart. With a soft sigh, Margaret reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing over the worn leather, before pulling out her cell phone. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen. For years, Margaret had lived humbly, despite her son's remarkable success. She was immensely proud of Jonathan Ellis, the CEO of Horizon Sky Airlines, but she had never leaned on his influence for special treatment. This time felt different. Her fingers dialed steadily. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mom?" Jonathan's deep, reassuring voice filled the line. "Is everything all right? Shouldn't you be on your flight by now?" Margaret's voice remained calm, though faint traces of weariness slipped through. "No, son. I've been removed from the flight," she said softly. There was a pause on the other end. Then Jonathan's voice returned, sharp and deliberate. "Removed? Why?" Margaret hesitated, not wanting to upset him, but she knew Jonathan needed to hear the truth. "The flight attendant, I don't think she liked the way I looked. She claimed I was causing a disturbance," Margaret explained carefully. "It was humiliating, but I didn't argue. I just left." For a moment, there was silence. When Jonathan spoke again, his voice was controlled, but the simmering anger was unmistakable. "Mom, are you serious? This happened on one of my planes?" "Yes, but don't worry," Margaret replied gently. "I didn't want to cause trouble. I just thought you should know. This isn't about me, it's about how people are treated. That flight attendant, I believe her name was Linda Prescott, she shouldn't treat anyone this way." Jonathan's tone hardened. Linda Prescott, he repeated, the name settling heavily on his tongue. I'll handle this, Mom. Are you okay? Where are you right now? I'm fine, Jonathan, Margaret assured him. I'm near gate 14, waiting. I'll call you back, Jonathan said firmly. As Margaret ended the call, she slipped the phone back into her handbag, her heart torn between concern for her son and quiet hope that this moment might bring meaningful change, not just for her, but for others who faced similar injustices. Back at Horizon Sky Airline's operations hub, Jonathan Ellis's call sent shockwaves through the staff. When his name flashed across the screen, Sarah Coleman, the senior operations manager, straightened in her chair and answered swiftly. Good evening, Mr. Ellis. Sarah greeted, her tone professional. Not so good, Sarah, Jonathan snapped. I just received an alarming report. My mother, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, was mistreated and forcibly removed from one of our flights. I need answers immediately. Sarah's face paled. Your mother? She repeated, her fingers flying over her keyboard to pull up flight records. Yes, my mother, Jonathan confirmed, his voice sharp. I understand she keeps her identity private to avoid favoritism, but that doesn't excuse what happened. I need to know who was responsible and why this wasn't brought to my attention. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, swallowing hard. Within seconds, she had pulled up the crew details and flight logs. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the report. It appears the lead flight attendant on that flight was Linda Prescott, Sarah said cautiously. She cited your mother as being disruptive and requested her removal before takeoff. Jonathan's grip tightened around his phone. Disruptive, he growled. Anyone who knows my mother knows she's the least disruptive person you'll ever meet. What else? Sarah hesitated. Several passengers filed complaints against Linda during boarding, she admitted. Some even recorded videos of her behavior. I'm retrieving the footage now, but from initial reports, it sounds like Mrs. Ellis was treated unfairly. Unfairly doesn't even begin to describe it, Jonathan said, his jaw clenched. Send me everything. Passenger complaints, footage, and Linda Prescott's entire personnel file. I want it all on my desk. Also, notify ground crew. I'm heading to the airport. When that flight lands, have security detain Linda Prescott. I want to speak with her personally. Yes, sir, Sarah responded, already signaling to her team. As the call ended, Jonathan took a deep breath to steady himself. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, calm, steady, even in the face of humiliation. Margaret Ellis never sought revenge, but Jonathan knew this wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring no one else would have to experience such blatant discrimination on one of his flights. He grabbed his coat and headed toward the exit. This isn't over, he muttered to himself. Jonathan Ellis strode purposefully through the terminal, his face set like stone as he approached the gate. His mother's words echoed in his mind, but the videos and complaints he had reviewed since their call only fueled the fire burning within him. This wasn't just a mistake. Linda Prescott's actions had crossed the line into something far more damaging. Jonathan's phone buzzed as he neared the gate. Security is in position, Mr. Ellis, Sarah Coleman, his senior operations manager, informed him. Linda is still on the plane preparing for takeoff. Good, Jonathan replied curtly. Have her brought to me immediately. I'm at gate 14. As Jonathan hung up, he glanced down the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the incident whispered among themselves. Some recognized him but said nothing, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval. Jonathan knew what had to be done. Back on the plane, Linda Prescott moved down the aisle with an exaggerated air of authority. She made her way through the cabin, inspecting passengers as if nothing had happened. A satisfied smirk played on her lips, a subtle display of triumph after Margaret Ellis had been escorted away. To Linda, this was a reaffirmation of control, a reminder to those on board that she ran this flight. Her victory was short-lived. Miss Linda Prescott, please report to the front of the cabin immediately, the intercom announced. Linda frowned, puzzled by the abrupt summons. Still confident, she adjusted her uniform and strode toward the front, shoulders squared. As she stepped through the doorway, two uniformed security officers waited just inside the jet bridge. One of the officers gestured toward the open door leading back into the terminal. Miss Prescott, we need you to step off the plane with us, he said firmly. Linda's eyes narrowed. What is this about? She demanded, her tone sharp. I have a flight to manage. The pilot, standing nearby, avoided her gaze. The other flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. "This isn't up for debate, ma'am," the officer replied. "Please come with us immediately." Linda scoffed but complied, muttering under her breath as she followed them off the plane. As Linda stepped into the terminal, her confident stride faltered. Waiting for her was Jonathan Ellis, flanked by members of the airline's legal team and operations staff. His gaze locked onto her the moment she appeared. For the first time, Linda's confidence wavered. "Mr. Ellis," she began, her voice tightening as she forced a polite smile. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I need to get back to my flight." Jonathan raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable but brimming with quiet fury. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Do you know who the passenger was that you had removed from this flight?" Linda blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. She hesitated. "She was causing a disturbance, sir. She refused to follow instructions." Jonathan's stare hardened. "That disturbance, as you called it, was my mother." The color drained from Linda's face. "Your mother?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan took a step closer, his words sharp and deliberate. "Yes, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, the woman you humiliated, mistreated, and falsely accused." His tone never wavered. "And I'm here to ensure you are held accountable for every action you took against her." Linda's mouth opened to protest, but Jonathan raised his hand once more. "Do you think I'm relying solely on my mother's account?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I've reviewed the security footage, read the passenger complaints, and watched every video recorded on board. Everything confirms that your behavior was not only unprofessional, but discriminatory and cruel." Linda's hands trembled as she tried to gather herself. "I was just following protocol, sir," she stammered. "She was being disruptive, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Jonathan snapped, his voice suddenly cold and unforgiving. "You singled her out because of how she looked, refused to assist her, and escalated the situation until she was forced off the plane. That isn't protocol, Miss Prescott. That's prejudice." Linda's eyes darted around the terminal, searching for some form of support, but there was none. The legal team stood silently. Sarah Coleman's eyes narrowed in quiet disapproval. The security officers waited for Jonathan's next command. "I have zero tolerance for this kind of behavior," Jonathan declared, his voice echoing in the terminal. "You have not only embarrassed this airline but tarnished its reputation and harmed an innocent woman." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "As of this moment, you are terminated. Hand over your ID badge, uniform, and any airline property immediately." Linda's mouth fell open. "Fired?" she gasped. "I've been with this airline for years. You can't just—" "I can," Jonathan interrupted coldly. "And I will. Your years of service don't excuse your actions." Linda's protests grew more frantic. "Please, sir, I didn't mean—" Jonathan raised his hand once more, silencing her. "This conversation is over," he said firmly. "Security, escort her from the premises." The officer stepped forward, one holding out a clipboard. "Sign here to acknowledge your termination," the officer said curtly. Tears welled in Linda's eyes as she scribbled her signature, her hands shaking. With nothing more to say, Linda handed over her badge and uniform jacket. As she was escorted away, her head hung low, a shadow of the confident figure who had strutted down the aisle just moments before. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his jaw still tight. But this was far from over. As Margaret Ellis sat quietly in the tranquil comfort of the VIP lounge, the weight of the day's events settled over her. The soft clink of china echoed faintly as she sipped her tea, gazing out over the tarmac beyond the large windows. Her son, Jonathan, had arranged for her to rest here while he handled the situation. Despite the serene setting, Margaret's thoughts drifted backward, drawn to memories both painful and bittersweet. Margaret had been born in the rural South during an era when segregation drew sharp lines between people. As a child, she vividly remembered the stark whites-only signs that barred her family from restaurants, schools, and theaters. The memory of her mother's firm grip on her hand as they passed by those forbidden places lingered like an old photograph etched in her mind. One memory stood out sharply. She had been 9 years old, standing in line at the general store with her father. Margaret had saved pennies for weeks to buy a small notebook for school. When their turn arrived, the shopkeeper, a heavy-set man with a cold glare, snatched the notebook from her hand. "We don't sell to your kind," he growled. Margaret's father, a quiet man of immense dignity, gently took her hand and led her out of the store without a word. But Margaret had seen the tears welling in his eyes. That moment shaped her. It fueled her determination to rise above prejudice, to build a life where such injustice couldn't hold her back. As Margaret grew older, life presented no shortage of challenges. She married young to a kind-hearted man named Samuel, who shared her dreams of providing a better life for their children. He worked tirelessly in the steel mills, while Margaret cleaned houses for wealthy families. The work was grueling, and Margaret often found herself treated as invisible, or worse, as someone unworthy of respect. One day, while dusting the dining room of a particularly harsh employer, she overheard the woman's dismissive voice as she entertained her guests. "People like her don't need education or ambition. They're meant to serve. That's all." Margaret hadn't said a word, but in her heart she made a solemn vow. "My children will never hear words like these. They will have opportunities I never did." That promise became her life's mission. Margaret worked double shifts, sometimes skipping meals to save money for her children's education. She encouraged them to dream without limits, always reminding them that their worth wasn't defined by the opinions of others, but by the integrity of their actions. Her son, Jonathan, had been bright and driven from an early age. Margaret still recalled the day he came rushing through the door, a notebook filled with airplane sketches in hand. "Mama, I'm going to build planes one day," he declared with excitement. Margaret had smiled at him and gently replied, "Then you better work hard, baby. Dreaming is free, but success comes at a price." And work hard he did. Jonathan excelled in school, earning scholarships that took him to places Margaret had only read about. He studied aeronautical engineering and business, eventually rising through the ranks of the aviation industry to become the CEO of one of the nation's largest airlines. At every major milestone, Jonathan never failed to remind the world, "This is because of her. My mother is the reason I'm here today." But Margaret's journey had not been without heartbreak. Samuel passed away when Jonathan was just a teenager, leaving her to raise their children alone. Those were the hardest years of her life. Margaret often worked 3 houses in a single day to keep food on the table and the lights on. Through it all, she never let her children see her despair. Their home, no matter how modest, was filled with love, laughter, and hope. Every night, Margaret read to them, instilling in their hearts the values of kindness, perseverance, and faith. Now, sitting in the stillness of the VIP lounge, Margaret reflected on how far she and her family had come. Despite the indignity she had faced that day, she refused to let bitterness take root in her heart. Instead, she reminded herself, just as she had taught Jonathan long ago, dignity isn't about how others treat you, it's about how you carry yourself no matter what. She straightened her posture, taking another sip of tea. The memories, though painful, had made her who she was. They were a part of her story, but not the end of it. Margaret had faced adversity before and emerged stronger every time. What she didn't realize was that Jonathan was already setting plans into motion, plans that would address the injustice she had endured and spark change far beyond the walls of that terminal. Jonathan Ellis stood in the conference room of Horizon Sky Airlines, his mind racing as he prepared to issue a public response to his mother's mistreatment. It was clear to him that what had happened to Margaret Ellis reflected deeper, systemic issues, ones he could no longer ignore. Determined to make lasting changes, Jonathan took immediate action. The first thing he did was ensure Margaret would be placed on the next available flight, in first class. She would be treated with the utmost care, from the moment she arrived at the gate to when she settled into her seat. Jonathan personally contacted the flight crew, making it clear that his mother was to be greeted warmly and with respect. No detail would be overlooked. At the same time, Jonathan began drafting a formal apology, not only to Margaret, but to all the passengers who had witnessed the incident. He knew this required more than private amends. This injustice demanded a public acknowledgement. Later that day, Horizon Sky Airlines issued an official statement, We deeply regret and apologize for the unacceptable treatment of one of our valued passengers, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, by a member of our staff. This behavior does not reflect the values of Horizon Sky Airlines. We are committed to addressing this incident with the seriousness it deserves, ensuring that no passenger is ever treated with such disrespect again. Effective immediately, the employee responsible has been terminated, and we are implementing mandatory inclusivity and professionalism training for all staff. To the passengers on Flight 814, we offer a full refund and a complimentary future flight as compensation for witnessing this distressing incident. To Mrs. Margaret Ellis, we extend our sincerest apologies and pledge that this moment will serve as a turning point for our company. The statement, signed by Jonathan Ellis himself, was posted to the airline's website and social media channels. Within minutes, it began attracting attention. However, the true explosion came when passengers from the flight shared their first-hand accounts. Videos taken on board began circulating online, capturing Margaret's calm dignity as she was escorted off the plane, contrasted by Linda Prescott's smug, condescending demeanor. A well-known travel blogger who had been on the flight uploaded a video titled, "The Strongest Woman I've Ever Met." This woman was treated unfairly, but she held her head high and never let them break her. She's a true inspiration, the blogger said. The video went viral, amassing millions of views within hours. Comments poured in from around the world. How could anyone treat such a sweet lady like that? This is exactly the kind of injustice we need to fix. Mrs. Margaret Ellis is a queen. I hope she's okay. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines splashed across social media and television. Airline CEO's mother humiliated by staff member, and Grace under fire. Elderly woman's poise shames flight attendant. While Margaret sat quietly in the VIP lounge, unaware of the growing storm, Jonathan was inundated with calls from journalists and activists. Some demanded further accountability. Others commended his swift, decisive action against Linda. Margaret's story became more than just an isolated incident. It evolved into a rallying cry for better treatment of passengers, especially those who were often overlooked or underestimated. Advocacy groups praised Margaret as a symbol of quiet strength and resilience. Yet despite the growing spotlight, Margaret remained humble. She hadn't sought recognition or sympathy. She simply wanted to reach her great-grandchildren. When Jonathan finally joined her in the lounge, he found his mother sitting calmly, knitting as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Mama," Jonathan greeted softly, settling into the chair beside her. Margaret looked up with a gentle smile. "You didn't have to do all this, baby." Jonathan shook his head. "Yes, I did. What happened to you wasn't right, and it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again, to you or anyone else." Margaret sighed, placing her knitting down for a moment. "You've always had such a big heart," she said, patting his hand. "But remember, Jonathan, we can't control how others treat us. We can only control how we respond." Her words, as always, struck him deeply. Jonathan nodded, determination settling in his eyes. His mother's quiet strength had shaped him his entire life. Now, it would guide the changes he planned to implement for Horizon Sky Airlines and beyond. For a moment, Jonathan sat silently, watching the gentle rhythm of Margaret's knitting needles. He had always known his mother to be strong, but this was something else entirely. Margaret wasn't asking for a symbolic apology or superficial change. She was asking to lead the charge. "Jonathan," she said, her voice steady, "I want you to transfer ownership of a major share of the airline to me." Jonathan blinked, momentarily stunned. "What?" he asked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "I want to be part of this company, not just in name but in action. If I'm going to help fix things, I need a seat at the table." Jonathan could hardly believe what he was hearing. His mother, who had spent decades enduring hardships quietly, never seeking recognition, was now asking for a stake in the company he had built. At first, he didn't know how to respond. But then, memories of her sacrifices came rushing back. The double shifts, the late nights, the moments she went without, so that he could have more. In that instant, Jonathan realized this wasn't just a personal request. This was a movement, and if anyone could lead it, it was Margaret Ellis. Jonathan took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, Mama, if you're sure this is what you want, I'll make it happen." His voice softened, thick with emotion. "You'll have a seat at the table." Jonathan Ellis sat across from his mother in the VIP lounge, watching as a rare smile lit up Margaret's face. For the first time since the incident, there was a glimmer of something more than quiet strength. There was purpose. "Thank you, Jonathan," Margaret said softly, her eyes reflecting gratitude but also resolve. "I know this is a big step, but I want to be there for the people who need to see that someone cares about them." Jonathan nodded, the weight of her words settling in. "You will, Mama. You'll have a seat at the table. You'll have a voice." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Jonathan wasted no time finalizing the legal transfer of shares, making Margaret Ellis a primary stakeholder in Horizon Sky Airlines. The announcement rippled through the company, sending shockwaves across the industry. Some executives raised eyebrows, skeptical about whether Margaret, a woman with little corporate experience, could navigate the complexities of the airline business. But Jonathan stood firm. "Her experience is exactly what this company needs," he told the board. "She knows what it means to be overlooked, to be dismissed. That's a perspective we've been missing for too long." The media's reaction was mixed. Many praised Margaret's courage and foresight, calling her a trailblazer for equity and representation in the aviation industry. Critics, however, questioned the decision, some even suggesting it was a publicity stunt. But Margaret wasn't concerned with the critics. She had a mission. From her first day as a shareholder, Margaret began driving real change. She advocated for comprehensive training programs on inclusivity, cultural sensitivity, and professional conduct, mandatory for every employee, from flight attendants to pilots to executives. She pushed for partnerships with community organizations, fostering diversity at every level of the company. Scholarships for underrepresented youth pursuing aviation careers were established under her leadership. Margaret wasn't just sitting at the table, she was reshaping it. Her presence could be felt throughout the company. Employees began noticing the difference. Flight crews reported feeling more empowered to speak out against discrimination. Passengers, especially from marginalized communities, expressed appreciation for the changes. Horizon Sky Airlines was no longer just an airline. It was becoming a symbol of progress and inclusion. Meanwhile, Linda Prescott's life began to unravel in ways she could have never anticipated. What Linda initially brushed off as a minor incident snowballed into a full-scale scandal. Her smugness during the flight, her dismissive treatment of Margaret, and her blatant disregard for fairness had struck a deep nerve with the public. The first signs of backlash appeared in her social media accounts, which were flooded with thousands of angry comments. Passenger videos of the incident, detailing her hostile tone and cruel actions, went viral under the hashtag Justice for Margaret. Linda's name became synonymous with discrimination and abuse of power. As more passengers shared their stories and videos, the media latched onto the narrative. Investigative journalists dug deeper into Linda's past, uncovering old comments and posts that revealed troubling views on race, class, and social status. Though these discoveries weren't directly tied to the flight, they painted a portrait of someone with deep-seated prejudice. Linda's once carefully curated image crumbled overnight. Horizon Sky Airlines, now under intense public scrutiny, faced pressure to distance itself from Linda. Margaret's decision to become a stakeholder had set a clear tone. There was no room for prejudice in this new era for the company. Within days, Linda was summoned to a formal meeting with the airline's HR department. The decision was swift and final. "Your contract is terminated, effective immediately," she was told. "Your actions violated our core values and code of conduct." Linda's protests fell on deaf ears. She tried to claim she had been misunderstood, arguing that the situation had been exaggerated. She even attempted to frame herself as a victim of workplace pressure. But her defense collapsed. Horizon Sky Airlines issued a public statement reinforcing their commitment to respect and inclusivity, making it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. "There is no place for discrimination or prejudice in our company. We stand firmly against any form of mistreatment toward passengers or employees." The public agreed. Linda Prescott wasn't just a disgraced flight attendant, she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the discrimination society was actively fighting to eradicate. As the news spread, Linda's career prospects evaporated almost overnight. Once plentiful job offers in the travel and hospitality industries disappeared. Other airlines, hotels, and agencies quietly blacklisted her. Unwilling to take the risk of associating with someone whose reputation had been so publicly tarnished, her social circles grew smaller. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy. Linda, once brimming with confidence and authority, found herself isolated, a shadow of her former self. In stark contrast, Margaret Ellis's influence only grew. She wasn't seeking personal gain, but her leadership began reshaping Horizon Sky Airlines and inspiring change across the industry. Margaret frequently appeared at press events, not to boast, but to advocate for systemic reform across aviation. It's not about one person. It's about changing the way we treat one another in the air and on the ground, she said at a conference. Passengers noticed the shift. Employees felt the change. Margaret's leadership wasn't symbolic. It was transformative. Her story had started as one of injustice, but it became a story of resilience, redemption, and the power of quiet strength. As the weeks passed, Linda Prescott's once polished life continued to unravel. The high-profile scandal had left her untouchable in the eyes of potential employers. Airlines, hotels, and even smaller charter services refused to consider her application, wary of associating their brand with someone whose name had become synonymous with prejudice and misconduct. Job interviews were rare, and the few that did materialize ended with polite rejections. "We're going in another direction," they would say, but Linda knew the truth. The stain of her actions followed her relentlessly. Social isolation soon accompanied professional exile. Friends grew distant, reluctant to be seen with someone at the center of such controversy. Linda found herself increasingly alone, confronting a harsh truth. Her behavior had brought about consequences she had never imagined. While Margaret Ellis's story sparked inspiration and systemic change, Linda's became a cautionary tale. She considered relocating to another city, hoping that a fresh start would allow her to rebuild her life. But wherever she went, the shadow of her actions loomed large. Online articles, social media posts, and news segments made sure of that. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellis had stepped fully into her new role as a key figure at Horizon Sky Airlines. Margaret wasn't simply a face for change, she was its architect. Her vision for the airline was clear: a steadfast commitment to diversity, inclusion, and fairness at every level of the business. Margaret's presence at Horizon Sky's headquarters wasn't symbolic. It served as a constant reminder of the transformation unfolding within the company. But it wasn't her presence alone that drove change. It was her decisive actions. Margaret implemented new policies aimed at preventing discrimination from ever happening again. Mandatory training programs focusing on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and inclusive communication were rolled out company-wide. Every employee, from the ground crew to senior executives, was required to participate. Hiring practices were overhauled. Margaret championed diverse hiring initiatives, ensuring representation across all departments: pilots, flight attendants, and leadership roles. Community outreach programs were established, offering scholarships and mentorship to underrepresented groups pursuing careers in aviation. Margaret wasn't just fixing the airline, she was reshaping the industry. Her leadership extended beyond policy changes. Margaret became a public figure, using her platform to address the incident directly. During her first public address as part of Horizon Sky's new public relations campaign, Margaret stood at the podium, her words clear and unwavering. "Every individual, regardless of race, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness," she stated to a room filled with reporters. "There is no room for disrespect in this world, and certainly no room for it on our flights. We stand for equality, and we stand for respect." Her message resonated deeply, not just with the media, but with the public at large. This was not about a single flight or a single incident. It was about a shift in how society addressed issues of prejudice, class, and dignity. Margaret's voice became a beacon of change, inspiring others beyond the aviation industry. Horizon Sky Airlines quickly became known as a leader in fostering inclusivity, setting the tone for airlines around the world. Under Margaret's influence, customer satisfaction soared. Passengers began to feel a difference: more valued, more respected. Employees, particularly those from marginalized communities, expressed renewed pride in working for a company actively pursuing fairness. But as Margaret's influence grew, Linda's life faded from the public eye. She was no longer part of a powerful system. Her legacy became a warning, a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice and cruelty could unravel a career and a reputation. For Margaret, however, the path was different. Her decision to step into the spotlight hadn't been about revenge. It had been about ensuring no one else would endure the kind of injustice she had faced. In the end, Margaret's grace, quiet determination, and unwavering sense of dignity reshaped not only the course of her own life, but the lives of many others. She had proven that even the smallest acts of perseverance, rooted in kindness and respect, could spark profound, lasting change.